Members, today we have gathered here for the study circle meeting on startup structuring, tax and regulatory aspects. We have with us an eminent speaker and our fellow colleague CA Amit Raj, who is going to address it. So may I request Vice Chairman Pramod Hegde to escort the speaker. May I request the Vice Chairman to please hand over the floor to the speaker. Thank you, sir. May I request the Vice Chairman to have a welcome speech for the August gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Tufal. Good evening, my professional colleagues. Esteemed Speaker, Mr. Amit Raj. As we stand in the Silicon Valley of India, there is perhaps no more fitting subject to address than the intricacies of the startup structuring, especially in the realms of taxation and regulation. The startup ecosystem of our country is at its blazing trails on the global stage. Every day, ambitious entrepreneurs bring forth ideas that have the potential to revolutionize industries. But as we all know, with this innovation comes responsibility. Ensuring that these startups are structured efficiently from a taxation and regulatory standpoint. And we all know compliance is just not a matter of compliance. It's a matter of securing their futures, optimizing their growth, and reinforcing the integrity of our financial and economic systems as well. This topic is testament to our evolving times. Our roles as a chartered accountants, financial advisors, and tax consultants is just not a number crunching or audit. It's more facilitating visionaries to realize their dreams in the most compliant and sustainable manner. Today, we have a rich knowledge gambit of experts who will share their insights and real-world experience and actionable strategies. We aim to have an encouraging discourse. One of that is much about learning and all about it is collaboration. To the speaker, Mr. Amit Raj, we are eager to learn from your expertise. And to the participants, I encourage active involvement, ask questions, challenge the conversations. Let's all together shape the future startups which are structuring in India. In conclusion, may the deliberation of today inspire and equip us to start a new era of entrepreneurship in India, defined by the robustness in the structure and clarity in compliance. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I have the privilege of introducing the speaker, Mr. Chartered Accountant Amit Raj. Amit Raj is a founding partner of ICA Advisories, and he went on to become as the youngest partner in a Big Four accounting firm before venturing into the startup ICA Advisors. Amit Raj has more than 18 years of professional experience in restructuring, amalgamations, demergers, valuation, capital reductions, repatriation and advisory assignments. Amit Raj has deep experience dealing with FEMA matters, real estate, pharma, startups, fintechs, and listed companies on various advisory engagements. Amit Raj is a commerce graduate, has pursued his law graduation, chartered account management accountant, and chartered accountancy. He is a rank holder in CA final as well as inter. He is a gold medalist as well, and is also a rank holder in his graduation examinations. Amit Raj speaks regularly across various forms on tax, regulatory and valuation aspects and has addressed more than 120 seminars. He is also visiting faculty to IIM Bangalore for corporate programs. With this brief introduction, I present before you CA Amit Raj. Over to you, sir.
Thanks sir, for the introduction and thanks for this opportunity. So, good evening everyone. For the next roughly 2 hours, what we'll look at is the entire gamut of startup structuring from a tax and regulatory standpoint. Starting from the basics in terms of what should be the entity form, should I start it as an LLP or should it be a company? Therefrom, should I have the holding company outside of India versus within India? And thereafter we'll look at, okay, if I need to set up, what are the pros and cons of each of these options. Like generally you would have seen a startup means you'll have a parent company either in Singapore or US for that matter. So what are the parameters which go in choosing a particular jurisdiction, we'll quickly walk through. And thereafter the structuring aspects in the sense that I am an India company, I want to be housed or located under a US entity or a Singapore company for that matter. What are the steps involved? And also the reverse also is taking place because initially what used to happen is many of the startups used to leave India, set up their shop either in US or Singapore more predominantly. Of late what has happened is with all this Zomato, Nykaa, Paytm listing, India market is giving better value. So many of them are trying to come back into India through what we call as an inversion process. So what you have gone out, that is one piece. Now we are also seeing a lot of companies which are coming back from a structure standpoint into India or back into India so that you can do a listing within India. So there are broad options around that in terms of what works, what doesn't work. Time permitting, we'll also look at some incentive planning like either it is an ESOP or founders you want to give what we call typically as a founder ESOP or an ESOP management stock option. What are the typical options that are in the market around that? And finally we'll conclude off with the strategy around ESOP, what are the types, etc. But my sense is we will just focus on all the critical aspects. Nothing is going to be theoretical here. Actual structures which have been implemented, which are being implemented will be discussed. Again, since it's a small gathering, would appreciate if it can be a little more interactive. Any questions, please feel free to pause, absolutely no problem. I'll not lose my thought, I'll begin. So the idea would be if questions are asked, then it is also a sign of indication or indication that you are also listening, following. It's also good that it breaks the monotony from my side. Okay. With this quick introduction, these are the broad contents for the discussion for today, which are sort of outlined each one of it. And the thought process here is, while it may look complicated, I'll try to simplify as much as possible. And the focus here will be on the key takeaways. If we are doing something in a particular way or in a particular manner, why it is being done in that particular manner would be the focus of it. So with that brief introduction, we'll sort of proceed. Now, first and foremost, a client sort of comes to you or you yourself want to start a company, start a startup for that matter. First and foremost, the basic thing will come, what should be the entity form? Should I do it as a company or do I need to do it as an LLP? As all of us know, LLP is very good from a tax perspective because what happens is I pay tax at the LLP level. Then I am able to distribute the profits to the partner without any incremental tax because there is a 10-2A exemption that is available. Only thing earlier, both company and LLP used to be taxed at the same rate. Now there is a tax rate differential because company goes at 22% base rate, LLP goes at 30% base rate. Assuming you are choosing that 115BAA tax regime that is there. Now that said, still from an overall repatriation standpoint, if you look at it, at company what happens, you pay 25% tax at the company level to take it out as dividend, you pay maximum of 36% tax. So effectively your tax rate would be 50%. LLP it's going to be about 34% including surcharges. Broadly in alignment. So therefore when you are trying to start a new business which is for the purpose of attracting investors etc. What is a good structure? Do I need to go as an LLP or do I need to go as a company? What's the broad answer purely from a tax standpoint? LLP, because that's how many of our practices also would be structured. It's a different matter that company cannot do CA practice, so therefore invariably it has to be an LLP. Now LLP, if you look at what are the advantages of LLP compared to a company, the compliance is very easy, single layer tax that we discussed. It's very easy to set up, administer because you don't have a board meeting, you don't need to file some few dozens of forms that need to be filed. Every special resolution you pass, you need to file a resolution, that copy of the resolution with the ROC, etc. It's very light, but the challenge here would be anything that is light from a compliance standpoint, from a governance standpoint, no investor will believe in that particular structure. Because it is so simple, so easy to deal with, you can always sort of manipulate or maneuver around whatever that is required. So pretty much you will not find in market even 0.1% of the entities which are structured as LLPs and which have raised money from venture capital investors. It may so happen your friend's family may give money to you without realizing what they are doing, etc. Because invariably the default option is a company. Many cases where the entity is structured as an LLP, we have got them converted into a company, followed by the investment by the investor into the company. Because what are the advantages of a company, leaving aside the tax if you look at it? One, it's very highly regulated. People understand the company structure quite well. And again, in a structure like a company, there is always going to be what we call as special rights that are accorded to the shareholders, preferential rights, preferential returns, etc., which all can be structured fairly easily in case of a company because there are equity shares as well as preference shares. Whatever right I want, I can put on a preference share. It can be like special voting rights, it can be veto rights, affirmative votes, whatever that is required. All of that can be sort of loaded on top of a preference share structure. Broadly clear with the thought process. So if you're doing it for the purpose of just generating money, distributing the money and living at peace, LLP is a structure. The idea is to scale up, grow, get investment, etc. Invariably it will have to be the company. That's a broad or key takeaway. Any doubt or anything, can we move on from this? Once we have chosen the company as a structure, here on all the discussion will be surrounding company because LLP is left behind at this juncture itself. Then comes the question, should I set up the company in India or should I set up the company outside of India in say Singapore jurisdiction? For everything I'll be taking Singapore because US, while people crib about India, US is horribly difficult to manage, horribly difficult to operate, extremely expensive. Going into US is easy, but coming out of US is next to impossible. I mean that is without paying taxes through your nose. So therefore it is never a good structure to go to US, which I will delve on it a little further. Now the discussion largely is, do I set up my startup in India or do I set up my startup outside of India? And whatever I am talking will be from the public domain itself. Like if you recollect, Flipkart originally used to be an India structure. Then they became a Singapore structure, and ultimately Walmart ended up buying Flipkart, majority stake. Even today some of the other secondaries keep happening. So if you look at it, Flipkart, entire near 100% business or 100% of the business is in India, but the structure is based out of Singapore. Likewise, you will find n number of cases which are all fairly large unicorns which have grown, which are structured out of Singapore, compared to being structured out of India. Like you will also find equally good number of companies which are structured out of India. So broadly, what are the advantages, disadvantages of being in India versus being outside of India? India means first thing, what do you hear generally from investors? Is it an easy jurisdiction or a tough jurisdiction? Very tough, which also keeps all of us busy, that's another matter. So it's a very complicated jurisdiction, so to say, because the compliances are large. Anything you do with a company these days, any allotment I do, if I do it at a premium, there is a problem. If I do it at a discount, there is a problem. Anything that we do if there is a tinge of any tax avoidance or a laundering that gets attributed, there is always going to be penal consequences. Then historically what has also been told generally is that the IP protection, intellectual property rights, etc. are quite weak in India. You'll have an idea, somebody may copy it, because you file a case, it runs for years. So these are the usual things which are seen negatively against setting up a company within India. Now, all said, while it's complicated to set up in India, the shift that has been happening of late is India is giving better valuations for these newer businesses. And also many clients, what they say is, I may be a 5,000 crore company. In India, if I do a listing, I'll be reasonably sized company where I'll get some visibility. Same 5,000 crore company, you go and list in US, you'll be a penny stock because it's a sub-billion dollar company. And here it is like a 100-200 crore IPO company. If you look at it, you will feel like, what are these guys doing? It's not worth anything. Likewise, if it is India company goes in US, it becomes something similar. So that's a challenge that you typically see. Very few companies out of India have gone and listed abroad and are reasonably successful. One of them being this Freshworks that is there, which has done this sort of a listing. But with India market giving better valuations, people are okay to live with the challenges that are there. And again, better valuation is today because India has not seen market-wise such newer companies which have a potential future, etc., at a bright future. If you look at Zomato, it listed at some price, it fell, now it's actually caught up. Paytm again, it's reviving. So those sort of companies, if you see Nykaa again, it went down and it's come back up. So that was a euphoria where you're still getting a better valuation. Even after the correction, many clients used to say that still, in spite of all the correction, India is giving me a better valuation. And many cases, people are willing to pay taxes, come down into India just to do a listing in India. So that's the stage that we are in. Now it is a matter of time. We need to wait and see how the global markets would perform vis-a-vis India. And once the India valuation sort of starts falling down, then it will go back to the original or the normal scenario where being outside sort of works. This is one piece that generally is in favor of India currently. What is against India could be, one is that it's a very tax heavy jurisdiction. The angel tax, all of it is quite a bit of a problem to deal with. Apart from that, IP we discussed. And other challenge that typically comes with India is that anything you do in terms of restructuring, it becomes quite complicated. So these are the downsides of being in India. Now, other things also that typically come up is many investors, which are these funds, do not have a mandate to invest in India companies. They will have a mandate only to invest in developed countries. Many of them are okay to put money in Singapore, but they may not be okay to put money in an India company. At one point in time, many investors used to give a term sheet saying, okay, I'll make the investment. One of the condition precedent means before doing this step, the investment doesn't happen. One of the condition precedent typically used to be that I need to flip my structure to Singapore. And that used to be the way, because from a compliance standpoint, visibility, enforceability of rights, etc., overseas countries obviously better. Now if you look at it from a overseas headquarters standpoint, whatever were the cons for India structure obviously become the pros for this particular structure. Reverse holds good. Even for the cons here would have been pros for the India company. Primary thing would be easier compliance, enforceability of rights is better, IP protection is anyway going to be better, and again many of them understand the rule of law and it is followed. What you write in contract and what is the outcome you get will be more or less aligned, which may not be the experience for many vis-a-vis India. While justice system is good, it will take long time before you get to the finality in terms of closure. Cons would be essentially, if I'm a small company listing overseas, I may not really get the visibility that I want to. Again, from a PR standpoint, a lot of companies say that we are proudly Indian, etc. While all of your business is in India, still you cannot say I'm proudly an Indian company because your headquarters is outside. So those are the challenges that typically comes when you go to government, because you may have a grouse around a particular issue that is plaguing the industry. You may not be taken with so much of seriousness vis-a-vis an Indian company going and representing with the government. So these are all the software issues that will come. And other than that, from a tax standpoint, what happens is I need to take care of this POEM risk, because if I have a headquarters outside of India, and if its turnover happens to be more than 50 crore, then we'll have to see where that entity is effectively controlled from. If it is effectively controlled or managed out of India, then that Singapore company or US company would be seen as an India company, India resident company from a tax standpoint. All the other implications, including the higher rate of tax of 40%, everything will start applying. So that is one problem statement that is there. Again, round tripping, earlier it was not defined, even today it is not defined. But prior to August 22, round tripping was not permitted in letter and spirit. Post August 2022, they have permitted round tripping subject to certain conditions, which you will probably see what it is. But as long as you are taking care of it, largely will be fine from a round tripping standpoint.
What is the full form? POE.
Place of effective management. This is that they have amended the section 6 to include a foreign company which is effectively controlled and managed out of India. They are going to treat it as an India resident company. Once you are an India resident company, even though you are structured outside, you will be taxed as if you were set up in India. So all the implications like paying taxes will apply, withholding tax will apply, all of it.
Also from a transfer pricing standpoint, where you have headquarters in overseas, larger implications.
Correct. So other bit in the business model also was supposed to come to. What happens is if I have a Singapore company, India company is where the operations are happening. Invariably what happens is if I have the holding company, my IP also has to sit in the same company. Then if IP has to sit in the same company, then India as a service provider, Singapore would be the service recipient. Because Singapore is a service recipient, what ends up happening is India needs to be compensated on a cost plus basis. It will so happen that as a group I am loss making, I am burning cash. Because of transfer pricing, I need to pay taxes in India because I am working on a cost plus basis. And once I am working on a cost plus basis, effectively I will book more expense in Singapore, but I will book a profit in India. Eventually what ends up happening is, as a group, profit would be minus, but my tax outgo would be quite significant. And again, from an India transfer pricing standpoint, 17% is a safe harbor rule that is there. At least 17 now it is okay. There used to be a phase some 5-6 years before where all the adjustments used to happen at 24-25%. Now at least that's sort of cooled off. 15-16 I think today's market you can make do or you can live with. But that's a cash outflow that is there. And one other related point is, anytime you have two entities, there is always going to be a friction from a tax standpoint. Because say I want to bring some money from Singapore to India or India to Singapore, there either will be a withholding tax, anything I try to do on a P&L perspective. There will either be a withholding tax, GST could come on a reverse charge basis. So all other complications will come compared to having one single layer in India, which is both the holding, there is no holding company, all the operations are within that India company. So these are the current trends, I broadly touched upon it. So many companies are relocating to India because the pricing on listing is better in India and they are okay to live with all these complexities around the taxes, etc. And the thing that is emerging of late is, even before the structure used to be, if I am having US business, US customers, I would have had a company in the US. If I am not having anything much to do with US, this default option used to be Singapore. And Singapore used to be just a holding company which will collect the money from the investors, push it back into India, be the IP holding entity. That's about it. Because typically Singapore as a market is very small. Use it just as a hub to hold investments in India, trade possibly with the Middle East, with the Southeast Asian countries, etc. And the rule of thumb was simple. If it is all India-centric business, Singapore holdco. US-centric business, it used to be US company. Now what has happened, over a period of time, Singapore is losing its sheen on two counts. One is India being better overall from a pricing or valuation standpoint. Second thing that is also happening is, from Singapore, they are trying to introduce this capital gain tax in Singapore, which is otherwise not there so far. From 2024, they are introducing this capital gain tax. What they are effectively saying is, unless you have substance in Singapore, we will levy tax. It's ulta. Generally speaking, if you have substance, then they will say, okay, this income is connected with Singapore, therefore I will say pay levy tax. Now they are saying reverse, like if you do not have substance, I am going to levy capital gain tax. Which means they will say that you need to have the key team CXOs operating out of Singapore. Because what they are also sensing is a lot of them are setting up companies in Singapore and using as a tax haven, which they don't want, with money laundering, all these things becoming more and more stringent. Their perspective also could be, all companies have anyway come, now let them also create more employment opportunities and let the Singapore economy grow. Otherwise, if you look at it, what was happening, even in Flipkart example if I take, all the investors put money in Singapore. What did Singapore do? It didn't do anything, it just took the money and put it onward into India. Was there any employment generated in Singapore? Forget the specific case, generally I am talking. Was there any employment generated in Singapore? Absolutely not, there will be no employee, nothing. But under law what is required is I need to have a resident director. So that resident director will get a 2,500 rupees of fees, you will get a nominee resident director. I need to have a company secretary. Again same, 2,000 Singapore dollars, you will get a company secretary. Third requirement they told, you need to have office. I get the company secretary's office only as the office address. Simple.
One employee is mandatory to be stationed.
It's not there. You need to have a resident director, resident company secretary. You don't need to have an employee in Singapore. In Mauritius it is 2 resident directors, but the point is both will be nominee itself. Practically, that's what is happening. So now with all of this happening, then what is Singapore getting? It is not getting anything. Money is flowing in and flowing out. Really nothing is happening in Singapore. And ultimately there will be no tax revenue either. Now the whole thought process is that by putting substance requirements, Singapore also will improve from as a jurisdiction. Now for the Indian guys, hiring somebody in Singapore will be 5 times, 10 times as expensive. And possibly they'll work even lower than what work I can get out of India. Then as a jurisdiction, it will end up losing its attractiveness. Why Singapore is doing this? Because of all this anti-money laundering checks, everything put in place. And these days, whoever is working in this, opening a bank account in Singapore is so painful. Earlier in one afternoon, you used to open a bank account. Now it is taking 2-3 months of time. When the company gets incorporated in a day, account opening is taking 3 months and even longer in many cases, because they get into so much of nitty-gritties in terms of who the owners are, who the director is, what is their profile, why this company is being set up. They are doing a complete scrutiny at the bank level to open the account. So that is what is happening. Beyond that, moving into India we discussed, and India as a jurisdiction is getting better appreciated with all the things that are happening around the world. We becoming for 5th economy now, 5th largest, on trajectory to become 3rd, etc. People are happy coming to India. While the problems are there, those all will be sorted in some way or other. And the other aspect that is also resulting in a lot of companies relocating to India would be, all the funds in India are structured as alternate investment funds. And if once you have an alternate investment fund, your job is to collect money from India, outside India, wherever, and put money in an Indian company. If I want to put money in an offshore company, which is a Singapore or US here, I need to get a SEBI approval. And that SEBI approval, annually there is a limit of $1.5 billion in terms of how much money can be taken out of India by this AIFs to make investment in foreign entities. That limit gets over in no time. And also it's a queue system that is there. Pretty much, and because of that what is happening is, many companies are getting frustrated because, let's say an AIF based in India will sign up to invest, but it is not able to invest because it needs to get this approval. Without the approval, money cannot leave India. Then that is also resulting or forcing few of the companies to relook at the structure. Why don't we be in India, so that at least I do not have this problem? Because India as a capital source also is improving or increasing quite a bit. And government also is working around it, because this angel tax, if you look at it, pre-April 23, non-residents were not subject to angel tax. Angel tax, for those not too clear, if an India company is allotting shares above fair value, then that fair value to the allotment price, whatever is the difference, that will be liable to tax. And to give an example, say the fair value of the India company was 100, I have done the allotment at say 150, 50 rupees is liable to tax in the hands of the India company which is allotted the share. This provision was earlier not applicable to non-residents. It was also not applicable to India funds, AIF or venture capital funds. Now they have removed this non-resident exemption. Now any allotment I do to non-resident, if it is above this fair value, I am getting caught. the simple logical question that will come is, why don't I do the allotment at the same fair value? Put it differently, 150 is the allotment price of commercially agreed. Why don't I get the valuation report also at 150? Very logical, right? Why will a valuation report trigger a tax? Problem that is happening in assessment is, I will no doubt get the valuation report at 150. At assessment level, what is happening is, assessment will take place 2 years down the line. They're comparing your actual with the projected. Obviously, to get to 150, you would have shown some projection. The projections are not being met, where your actuals is lower than projection. Two things the department is trying to do. One is they'll disregard your valuation report, saying that it is not anticipated with appropriate accurateness of the projection. Projected you could have accurately anyway figured, then there's no end to it actually, but that's what it is. Few other cases what I have seen is your actual was only 40% of projected. Simple thing is, okay, I'll take your fair value, I'll apply 40% multiplier on that. What was your 150 will now become 60 or 90 rupees I'll levy tax. This is the provision. This provision or this challenge is not applicable to any allotment done to a resident venture capital fund. And also resident venture capital fund is constrained from putting money outside of India. So therefore the idea is that they are trying to bring the money pooling business into India on one hand, and also the startups also invariably are being forced or nurtured in some sense, and also with the growing attractiveness of India as a jurisdiction, the movement also is happening. So today I have seen both sorts of companies. If it is US SaaS based business, many of the companies do a B2B sort of a transaction. B2B invariably what is happening is, no US company wants to deal with the India company for business. They want to deal only with another US entity. Invariably same thing happens with UK, Germany, wherever you look at it. Two structures again. One is, I can have an India company as a holding company, US company with a sales office. That also sort of structurally is okay. But many of them prefer that I will eventually get acquired by a US entity. So therefore I will go to US, whatever other problems that is okay, I'll deal with it. That is a very small cohort of companies today that you can find. Because as I said, it's extremely expensive and impossible to come up. With that, you're seeing a small set of companies which are going to US. Many of them are not really too enthusiastic to go outside these days, like in the last 9 months what's been the trend. Any questions on this?
So one small trend which I observed is this, now these SaaS companies, right?
Yeah.
Now they have been focusing a lot on Ireland, because we do get a lot of services from a lot of SaaS-based companies which are based out of Ireland.
Yeah, Ireland as a holding company, nobody goes to Ireland to set up the holding company. In Ireland, what has happened is basically all these US-based multinationals have set up Irish companies. There is also a loophole of no withholding tax, etc. If you look at Google, Facebook, all of them have set up companies in Ireland, even Apple for that matter, where they are able to sort of channel most of the money that is there around the world into Ireland by using a Dutch company as a sandwich, like Irish-Dutch sandwich, something like that they call. So effectively what they have managed to do is move all the money into Ireland by taking participation exemption, don't pay tax in Ireland. And also Ireland is made as an operating company because it is getting independent revenues from everywhere. US I do not pay tax because I have kept money in an operating company which is Ireland. So those structures, Ireland also has plugged that loophole, what is there, with a lot of pressure from US and European Union, etc. Because today OECD is moving towards a direction where countries should not compete on the basis of tax to attract capital. You need to have inherent value. You cannot simply reduce your tax and try to attract companies. In the same line, even this 15% global minimum tax rate also is coming because of that. And Ireland, they have basically grandfathered that or put a sunset on that particular benefit. So that is again, Ireland comes below the structure, it never comes on top of the structure. And for instance, Apple, I think they had about $200 billion or $150 billion of cash sitting in Ireland. Bring it back to US, they need to pay tax. To do buyback and pay dividend, they are borrowing within US to do buyback. But the cash that they have, they have kept it in Ireland. Just to bring it back, it will cost you 25% of tax. Okay. Now we will focus on structure setup, which is an overseas structure. what are the countries typically that are used? I'm not going to put a comparative, broadly we'll discuss. And again, these countries are put in order of preference also in some sense. Singapore comes at the top because it is easy to set up, but for this bank account business, whatever is there, well understood, law, culturally it is somewhat similar to India. Cost of setting up operating also is not much because invariably you will find some Indian there from our perspective I'm saying. Again, it's an easy jurisdiction and the company law, everything looks very similar to India because both are basically a rip-off of the UK companies are. So you will find a lot of similarities in section if you look at a buyback, if you look at a dividend. Most of it is very common, and if you have an understanding of how the India law works from a structure standpoint, you read Singapore law, it looks very identical or very similar. So it's much easier to sort of as practitioners or professionals here also for us to deal with Singapore company. Obviously, for Singapore, if you look at it, what is its core strength? Does it have a large market? Does it have a large population? If somebody is going to Singapore, why are they going? Something should be attractive there. What are the attractions in Singapore? It has a good judicial system, speedy justice delivery, no corruption whatsoever. And also the overall thought process there is that once something is attractive, people get to it, and they've ensured that the attractiveness continues year after again. And therefore, how all this thing plays out is, any enforcement of contract is very seamless, predictable, timely, etc. And tax also is quite low because it is 17% corporate tax that is there in Singapore. And generally, if you look at it, any structuring you do with an MNC, one country the tax is 30%, one country the tax is 70%, one more country like say Ireland, the effective rate of tax is 12.5%. Where will you try to keep the income? 12.5, 17 or 30? Logically 12.5, something is 0, what will you do? Invariably you will try to go to 0, but generally what we always advise is anything that is 0 is also very risky because the scrutiny of that 0 structure is going to be much critical, and invariably you will get caught somewhere or other. That's been the general thing. Now with Singapore being the lowest tax rate country in this particular belt, like Asian belt for instance, many companies tend to set up in Singapore, the holding companies, and also move the income into Singapore because it's the lowest rate of tax. Conceptually that is the way it is. Now again, because it is as a jurisdiction being abused so much, they are losing their overall perception in the market. Same problem that was there with Dubai earlier. Dubai means what? It used to be basically money laundering, hawala, all this thing. They've reformed themselves quite a bit with DIFC, everything coming in. Singapore, they're cautious that they don't want to be seen on par with Dubai like people are abusing it. So that's one commentary. So if you anyway want to set up overseas, and if you're not having too much of business in the US, the default structure would be Singapore. Now next best thing would be US because most of the capital, like 70% of the capital in the world is US source. And as a company, I want to deal with a lot of US customers, and invariably I also want to sell my company to a US player. If I'm in IT, I can possibly sell to Cisco or one of these larger companies like Apple, Amazon, etc. Those guys are fine, cool, we'll take care of the compliance, I'll set up in US because I'm a target for acquisition. And they'll work also that way, they'll scale up the business in such a way that some company will simply acquire them and use them as an additional offering in their overall bouquet of services. So those sort of companies invariably end up going into the US. And a lot of companies, you would have heard of this Y Combinator, where it's like a startup boot camp sort of a thing, where they pump in I think about $600 or whatever $1,000 into the company. So there invariably all the companies would be set up within the US. So that could be where you start off as an accelerator, could be a YC company. You'll invariably be stuck in US and then the whole life will continue. Again, UK was reasonably good for some time when they reduced their tax to 19% etc. With Brexit, it's pretty much lost. And it's extremely expensive in UK to sort of hire anybody or even function out of the UK. Ireland we discussed, it is not seen as a holding company jurisdiction but more as a group company jurisdiction. Mauritius, pretty much no go from any startup. rarely you will find any startup having a structured holding company out of Mauritius. It will all be the investors who used to come through Mauritius. Why? Capital gain exemption used to be there till April 2017, or investments made until April 2017. Thereafter, the capital gain exemption has been removed. Now it is on par with any other country. So therefore, it is losing its sheen also from a fund management industry, and GIFT is doing fairly well in this particular account. And last you have UAE, again barring crypto or other businesses which you cannot set up in other jurisdictions, people end up going to UAE. Like all these crypto companies, Singapore doesn't welcome them. Rather, it's as hostile as India to these crypto companies. UAE is generally seen as a favorable jurisdiction, so many of them end up going to UAE. So when advising on clients or when you're evaluating, what are the critical things would be, why do you want to set up overseas? That's a starting point. Then what is your operating model, where the customers will be, and also you need to ask the client particularly or critically saying, is it really worth the pain going outside, or what are we gaining? As a fad it used to be, because one point in time myself, we used to send some 20-25 companies in a year abroad. So now it's actually come down quite a bit. Now we are also working on a lot of transactions on how to bring what is abroad back into India. So that's what is currently happening. Either way we will have work, like either sending out or bringing back in. That apart, on a serious note, if you are trying to set up a structure, set it up the right way, which will be sustainable for the client. I'll put it that way. Or if you are doing it for yourself also, it should sort of sustain over a period of time.
Netherlands also.
Netherlands again, participation exemption etc. is there. It is not seen as a good jurisdiction to set up startups. Generally what happens is, I want to set up a company in a country as a holding company which has a very low tax on the corporate income that it gets, and also it should not levy any dividend or any withholding tax on the dividends that you pay out. These two things, because then there is a good flexibility in the structure that I bring the operating money into the holdco and holdco distributes it without an additional layer of tax. So Singapore would be one of the very few countries where there is no withholding tax on dividend. You go to the Netherlands etc., there is a dividend withholding that will come. And also it's a 25% tax in Netherlands. So generally that's the reason why you will not find them acting as a hub for setting up startups. Because the whole idea here is, if you look at it conceptually, Western countries, if you go, the thing is it's expected outcome you'll get from a legal proceeding etc. All of that, which is predictability, transparency, fairness etc. All of that is also being replicated in Singapore at a system level. So therefore there is no need to go and search for some other country. It is like this, either you be in US or you be in Singapore. That's the way it will work. While other countries are there, it's invariably it will not work. So you'll rarely find any company going into Netherlands, which is an India-based company. Maybe a lot of this Europe-based companies can go.
Europe.
For them it's culturally similar. For us, right from language, everything would be different. So it's also like, it's like trend that's caught up. It's only two options that, as I mentioned, it is either US or Singapore. UK came and it went. It has to be English speaking from our perspective so that its comfort is there. And also the perception in the hands of in the eyes of the investor, which is also there. Okay. Then we'll move on to the structure setup. Broadly, I will touch upon the FEMA implications also. So till August 22, this round tripping was not permitted. In the sense, what do I mean by round tripping is, an Indian investor having investment in a foreign entity, where that foreign entity has an investment back in India. Clear? It is India on top, foreign, then India. Then there are different interpretations on round tripping, like whether round tripping will mean only 1 rupee I take out or $1 I take out from India, put it in say Singapore, and Singapore puts the same money back in India. That used to be one view of round tripping. Other view of round tripping used to be that I have India, I have Singapore, I have India back again. As long as the ownership flows, it is round tripping. We're not possibly bothered in terms of what money went from India and whether the same money came back into India. So there were a lot of variants around this, and around round tripping, you will only find some compounding orders on the RBI website where they have levied a compounding levy, where because of this round trip structure, they have told that you have violated certain rules, laws, etc., and then they have basically done put this levy. So the one second. Now, sorry. Post August, they permitted round tripping, saying that as long as the company in which you invest overseas, the first layer, does not have more than 2 layers of foreign companies in between before coming to India, structure is fine. Because from RBI standpoint, they were sort of pushing back quite a bit, but in reality, everybody was to do the gift structure. And what do I mean by gift structure is some relative friend, whoever used to set up a Singapore company. When the company is set up, bank account is opened, the shares used to be gifted to the founder based in India. And that used to be, I would have done like more than 100 transactions like that. RBI was always at unease with gift happening. But invariably for many of the companies it was like a scenario where I have to set up the structure, otherwise I'm not going to get investment from an investor. We'll figure this RBI piece later. Gift is permissible otherwise in the law. Forget the spirit, people used to go ahead and do. Now what has happened is RBI sensed all of this and government also has pushed and startup industry also has gone and lobbied quite a bit. Now they are told okay, round tripping will permit, but we will not let you do this gift business and all. Whatever you do, you need to report in India. And RBI's thing is simple, whatever business you do, we don't have a problem. Please going forward report in India. And even your past structures you need to regularize by reporting. They'll put some 2-3 lakh of compounding fee for the earlier gift structures, whatever happened. So now the requirement is fairly simple. As an investor, individual for instance, I have 2 routes. One is I can go without control route, other is with control route. So the threshold for control has been just set at 10%. I can be in control still being below 10%, but once I am above 10%, I cannot argue or do not have control because one of the base criteria for control is 10%. Clear? Now the way they are saying is, if as an individual I am having above 10% or I have control, that company overseas should be a single level operating company. It cannot have subsidiary anywhere in the world, including India. Clear? If it has to have a subsidiary and if I as an Indian resident should have more than 10%, I need to channel my investment through an India vehicle. India vehicle, you have 3 options. It can be a company, LLP or a partnership firm. Company generally we do not recommend because it could become NBFC. Later whenever there is an exit, profit comes into the company, to take it out I pay another dividend tax. Then by eliminating company you are left with either setting up the first layer. In the diagram I have written as India firm. That can be a company or an LLP. So it can be a LLP or a partnership firm. LLP also has a similar problem of being called as an NBFC because there are a few cases ROC has issued notices saying that when I set up the company I would have told my objective is ABC. Ultimately if you look at the structure of the company it would be like an investment company. Once it's investment company, you get a show cause notice in terms of why don't you convert yourself into a company. Because RBI has mandated ROC not to permit LLPs to be engaged in financial services activity. And there's some internal circular or something notification they have issued which we don't have obviously a copy of. But this is the understanding and in many cases they have issued notices saying, and even at the first instance when I'm trying to set up the LLP, if I choose financial services activity, they will say please enclose the RBI approval for setting up financial services entity in LLP. You would have seen, few of you would have done, incorporation would have seen. You will never get approval from RBI to do financial services in LLP because LLP as an entity form is outside RBI's purview. It cannot regulate an LLP. So therefore what they have done, they have gone behind and basically told that we do not let LLP function in this financial services itself. So whatever financial services activity you do, RBI will have a say on it. Fairly clear? So beyond LLP, the only other structure that is left is partnership firm. There is a general partnership firm governed under the Partnership Act of 1932, Indian Partnership Act of 1932. It needs to be registered with the registrar of firms for it to make an ODI. You cannot have any random general partnership firm doing an ODI, it has to be registered with the registrar of firm. Not so complicated in a day, 2 day, 3 day time, but that's like the bare minimum. Once that is set up, a firm can then do ODI, overseas direct investment in a foreign entity. Foreign entity can in turn set up the India company. There's no problem here on. As long as I put a firm in India, individual puts money into the firm puts money into the foreign entity. Foreign entity can go ahead and do even round trip structure. As of today or post August 22, this is all fine. Any doubts on this?
Two questions. First one is, could there also be another setup like a private trust? Second one is, legally a partnership firm cannot hold shares. So would that have a...
Sure. So the first question, private trust cannot make a foreign investment because an Indian party capable of making overseas investment is only company, LLP and a registered partnership firm. So trust is precluded from making any overseas investment. Only with I think RBI approval, trusts which are engaged in either hospital, charitable trust that is, or education can do with RBI approval, but generally you cannot have a private trust doing. Even if it's a private trust, the structures what we set up is, trust will be a partner in the firm in turn will go and make the investment. That's the way it is usually done. Now your second question, can the firm hold shares in a company? Firm, as all of us know, does not have a distinct legal entity status. It cannot hold in its own name, but it will be always held in the name on behalf of the firm. Like even in India company, forget overseas, even in India companies if you see, it will always be one of the partner holding on behalf of the firm. So it is like how you order the names is a key takeaway there. If I write the firm name first represented by the partner, you will get stuck. It has to be ulta. It is basically the partner representing the firm. It is fine. From a tax standpoint, what happens is it's a diversion of income by overriding title. Any income, though the partner is holding, he is holding in nominee capacity foreign on behalf of the firm. That's the way it will work. Same goes with trust being a shareholder in an India company. Anyway, it can't go abroad. Trust being a partner in the LLP, it's the same thing. That the partner will represent the trust by being a shareholder or by being a partner in the LLP. So if it's a private trust structure, if you want, it will be individual on top, private trust, partnership firm, then you have the foreign company in India. Any other question? So this two-layer structure for round tripping I mentioned, maybe we'll see with the help of an illustration as well. Here if you look at it, India company is putting money in US entity. US entity in turn has investment in Singapore. Singapore has put money in another India company which is XYZ. Firstly, is this round tripping or no?
India money coming back to India.
Structure is round tripped or no?
Yes.
Simple, because you start from India, come back into India is round tripping. Some trip you started, gone and come back. Now, how many layers are there between India company and the investee company? Here, investee company would be US company into which I put the money. That company to India company, I cannot have more than 2 layers. Here, I have got only 1 layer, correct? Which is only that Singapore company, ABCPT Singapore. Therefore, this structure is fine. Now, here, if you look at it, India company is putting money in US. US holds structure in Singapore. Singapore holds shares in Luxembourg. Luxembourg has in turn put money back into India. Is it a round trip structure? Yes. Is this permitted? It's more than 2 layers. Because if you look at it, India put money in USA, that is layer 1. Singapore is layer 2, Luxembourg is layer 3. Therefore, it will get lost. From RBI standpoint, they are basically saying, okay, go and do, you are anyway not listening. At least do not do too many layers that will not be able to track. 2 layers you do, we are okay. Beyond that, please don't. Okay. Now, just back to this. This applies only in respect of investment in India. So here below US I may have Netherlands below I can have one say UK, below UK I can have one more US, etc. That under FEMA there is no problem, that's perfectly fine. But you will get caught in Companies Act, because in FEMA all that it says is I need to put money in an operating company which is engaged in bona fide operations, or I can put money via an SPV which will in turn invest money into an operating company. That's the way it reads. Which means cannot have India company, I cannot have two holding companies and then do one more company below. That is not permitted under FINMA. Am I clear? I cannot have India company on top, which will hold holding company 1, which is overseas, holding company 2 again overseas, which will hold shares in an operating company. That is not okay. Fairly clear? Reverse. India company puts money in holding company 1, which in turn puts money in operating company. Below that operating company, I am having 10 layers of holding companies. No violation under FINMA. Clear with the distinction? Now comes Companies Act. There are two sections which deals with under Companies Act. One is under 186. What it says is any investment I make cannot be made through more than 2 layers of holding companies. That is one condition that is there. One more condition is there is the number of layers in terms of subsidiary, which is under section 2(87) in subsidiary definition. What it basically says is I cannot have any layers like this. You can have holding company on top, one layer and one more layer. It's 1, 2, 3 you can have. If the immediate entity, that holding company and its immediate company are wholly owned subsidiary, you ignore that. It can be 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3, 4 subject to this being the wholly owned subsidiary. That's the thing. Exception to this is if the structure is already set up and I'm acquiring, that is okay if it's an overseas structure setup. Clear? So these things, again, gone are the days where treaty shopping used to be so easy and prevalent that I'll set up one holding company for each country depending on which treaty I get, etc. Because these days you're not anyway going to get treaty benefit with all the anti-abuse provisions that are being built in MFN, sorry, all the clauses that have come in for this treaty abuse, etc. So therefore, overseas structuring has become fairly straightforward these days. As long as you have operations, you'll get the benefit of the treaty. If not, you're not going to get that particular benefit with all this web stretching, etc. being in picture.
What is the main benefit of this outfitting?
It's more than main benefit, this structure is permitted. It's not like a benefit. The whole point is, I'm a startup founder, I want to set up a company in US which will go for IPO in the US. Now, okay, I put money in US, but all the operations will be in India because that's where the arbitrage will come. Then in the historical structure, what used to happen is, from India I made the investment into US, but US cannot have a subsidiary back in India. It used to be prohibited or restricted. Now they have opened it. So this is again, it's not about advantage, it's the disadvantage of not having a structure feasible in India is now being removed.
I know a case where an Indian company invested in an Italian company which is into dredging. That dredging company set up a subsidiary in India for one particular project with ONGC. So what do you do? That's a global company that has got a global operation.
That will be a problem. Then most of this Indian companies, why they are faring well in this offshore markets is because of the labor arbitrage. Earlier what used to be all these biggies, if you look at, they are more on the services side where the clients will define what work you need to do. Then basically you charge $100 and you pay $10, $20 for the India employees. Delta you used to make as your margin. That used to be the broad model, even today that is in the services sector. But all the startups are not in services business because you cannot hire thousands of people to do the work. They are all focused on on the product side of it. While you are on the product side, still you want a labor arbitrage. Labor arbitrage will come by having subsidiary in India. Now the question is, I need to have operations in India and products sitting outside, conceptually. I can also do India holding company and then have a US sales office, which we discuss why it may not work for US SaaS based businesses, etc.
For example, if you are developing a good IT product, you want to be protected under US law, you set up there. You also outsource the work to Indian company, they will do all the work but patent it with the US. And worldwide they will give the license of their software to many companies. And they will form many subsidiaries. One subsidiary would be in India.
And all the implementation and solutions also can be done by the India company as a service contract, etc. I'm going to discuss that, one of the models of the startup company.
Does Freshwork works on this model?
Pretty much any India company which has gone outside works on this model. So invariably you will have staff in India, that's where the arbitrage comes. Even for Microsoft to have 15,000-20,000 people in India, it's the same thing. Closer to us, if you look at all the big four, all of them have the GDS, what they call Global Delivery Centers in India. which is basically people or professionals here are hired at a markup to the current whatever prevailing rate. But what work they are doing? They are essentially doing back office work for a US based CA firm. So it is more like they will be the client facing and you will be executing the work here. You will be conversant or need to be conversant with the US law, etc. But over a period of time, what ends up happening is you will become more like a US professional, and if you eventually want to migrate to US, it's a very good sort of a thing. But if you want to come out of it and do any other routine CA work to do, then that becomes a problem. That's also the arbitrage scheme. Okay, then moving forward, so far what we have discussed, entity firm. Second was where do I set up my holding company, India or outside. Advantages, everything we saw. We also looked at the FEMA implications in terms of how do I set up. Next phase is, I am already running some business in India. I want to now have a US or Singapore holdco for that matter. How do I accomplish that? One is setting up the structure newly is very easy. All that I need to do is I put up a firm in India which will set up a Singapore company. That Singapore company needs to set up operations back in India. Fairly simple. Complexity will come as if it's a new business, all good, no problem. But invariably what happens is many founders, if it's a new business, if you say okay we'll structure like this, etc., they'll say, boss, they'll say I have only few $1,000. I can't spend on setting up your structure. We don't know whether this business will survive or not. Let us rather conserve the cash, put it in the business, let it run. If it survives and tomorrow I want to do, I will do it at that point in time. Which is like a very natural thing, even what we will do, because saying is simple, you do not put cart before the horse. It always has to be horse and the cart, that in that order. So that's what many of the founders say. Now invariably, all said and done, whatever business has started is functioning in India. Now I want to put up the holding company outside. So this is the problem statement what we have got. The question is, how do we sort of get there? Now there are very age-old rudimentary ways. Rudimentary, I mean all the startup structuring has been in vogue only for the last 8-10 years actually. How it used to be done at that point in time, what are the advancements that have happened, or what are the pitfalls one needs to avoid, because we are also in the car regime today. So those are the critical things that would come in. Maybe I'll just go to the second option first. These are the larger companies had initially, which was in India, migrated out of India. So the structure is fairly simple. You get all the investors to set up the structure in Singapore. Okay. So the way it will work is I may put 5 million into India, 10 million into India. I may be holding 20% share as an investor. A new company will be set up in Singapore with identical shareholding pattern. Like in India, if you look at it, the shareholding may be something like this. Founder is holding 50, investor A is holding 30, investor B is holding 20. Okay. But each of them have come at a very different cost. Founder would have put only 1 lakh, 10 lakh, whatever. 30% guy may have put in like say 3 million. 20% guy came in later, he has put 10 million for his only 20% stake. Is that possible? Very much possible. If the company is growing, that is how the pattern will look like. Now with this fact pattern, I want to set up this overseas company. What happens in overseas companies? Can I expect the same investor to put back 10 million all over again? He has already put, the company has eaten up all done. So when a structure like this gets set up, what happens is founder will set up the company with some $1,000-$2,000. Investors will put in $500, $600 or $800, whatever that could be, nominal amounts, so that the shareholding pattern of the Singapore company would be identical. What was 50, 20, 30 will also become 50, 20, 30. Instead of putting millions of dollars, it may be all $5,000, all of them touching together and putting. Clear? Is there any economic loss for anybody here? Can the 20% investors say the founder that you got your 50% free of cost? Yes, no. No, because they also have got free of cost, we are also having free of cost. Fair enough? So that way we set up the company to start with a nominal capital, which is what we call as mirror capital. Mirror is what is in India is mirror, simple. Then that Singapore company will set up a subsidiary in India, because I want to have the operations in India. Then what happens is the entire operations of the India company needs to be moved into the new India company. From the existing India company, I need to move the operations into the new India company. What are the ways in which I can move the business? Any thoughts? Can do a BTA, which we call as a slump sale. I can do an asset transfer agreement, or I'll not do any transfer of asset. I'll fire all the employees here and I'll rehire all the employees there. But in a startup, typically, if you look at it, what will be there? It's only laptops, etc. That laptop I can even scrap, lease, whatever I want to do, I'll do. So that way, in effect, what is happening is the business of the existing India company is being transitioned to the new India company. Fairly clear? Now, same example I'll stick to. Last investor put 10 million for a 20% stake. What is the value of the company or the business?
200.
10 million for 20%. 50 million into 20 is 10. Clear? Now the sale of business will be done at what value? Or what value it should be done at? 50 million. No loss for anybody. Now if you do it 50 million, $10 million will be the tax. Who will pay? Clear now? Business enterprise value is 50 million, I am agreeing. But if you look at the asset, it got 10 million, they have burned it down. Slump sale, if I do, what is the net worth versus the consideration I need to pay tax? My net worth may be only 1 million before this transaction. Now company value is 50 million, asset is 1 million. If I do the slump sale at 50 million, what would be the tax payable? 50 minus 1, 49, 49 into 23%. Correct? So that would be roughly 10-11 million of tax. Will they have money to pay? Put it differently, if they have money also, will anybody pay? Answer would be obviously no one wants to pay, because the whole idea here is it's not about whether it is legitimate or not. Their point is, have I made that money? Has anybody paid me that cash? No. Nobody has paid me. Just on paper value or in books I have got some value. Why should I pay tax on it? Clear? Now, if you look at it from a transfer pricing standpoint, who is the seller? India company. Who is the buyer? New India company. Are both residents?
Yes.
Is there a transfer pricing element applicable to this? Assume Singapore company is not party to any contracts. Technically speaking, it is between two residents. Transfer pricing will apply where one of the party or both is a non-resident and the income pertains to India. So here if you look at it, it is both are happening within India. Technically speaking, with transfer pricing does not apply. International transfer pricing.
Because indirectly, Singapore company is holding the stake in the new Indian company.
That's a risk I'm coming to.
Yeah.
I'm just going layer by layer in terms of is there a risk on this thing. Transfer pricing technically does not apply. It's also not a transaction covered under the domestic transfer pricing regime because they are all dealing with some tax holiday cases. Fair? Technically speaking, transfer pricing will not or should not apply. I'm also keeping the Singapore company out so that it doesn't qualify as a deemed international transaction. Fairly clear, it's within India to India, I can technically do at any price. Now comes the question, what is the real value of the business? 50 million. Who is getting the benefit of that 50 million today? India company or indirectly the Singapore company, to the point he made. Indirectly Singapore company is getting the thing. Today we are under GAR regime. When coming under GAR regime, the question can be simply put, company value was 50 million when you raised the previous round. Today, how are you trying to do the sale of the business at 1 million? This will be the question which you will simply have to bang your head. There's no way out of it, unfortunately. Again, the amount of tax avoided, etc. is more than 3 crore. You will anyway get stuck with the objective thresholds of triggering GAR. Clear? This used to be the way historically all the externalization structures have been done. Where you simply set up a new structure, do the slump sales from here to there at book value, claim there is no TP, no valuation, nothing applicable. Many of them have got away and are also getting away as we speak. Now the inherent risk here, if you look at it, is I've sold a business which is valued 50 million effectively at a $1 million valuation, where there is a implicit gain on which tax has not been paid on 49 millions of this. Now what are the ways to finesse this? If I do it as an asset sale, is it a business transfer? No. What have I sold? Laptop. Can laptop having a cost of $1 million be valued at 50 million? Because I get a new laptop also at $1 million. Is it possible? No. Now along with laptop sale, have I also moved the employees indirectly somewhere? Answer is yes. Now if you combine the two, isn't it a slump sale? It invariably becomes a slump sale because there are few case laws in Mahindra also where Supreme Court has said, what was a slump sale, they structured it as an asset sale. They told because it has all the ingredients of a slump sale, while it is not complying with the definition of slump sale, still I tax you a slump sale. Because the department went on appeal there because slump sale you pay tax upfront depending on the net worth. If it is asset sale, what happens is I reduce it from the block of the asset. That's a broad concept, sorry for digressing. Again, if I am doing asset sale, the same issue will come. Then what is the better way to do? If there is a way. Best thing is don't do anything. Then the structure itself doesn't get set up. How it is done is, if you have time on hand, what I end up doing is what we call as a ramp up, ramp down. What does ramp up means is, all the new business, whatever is coming, I'll get everything in the new company. Whatever is the old business, because it will not continue for life. No, over a period of time, it will sort of die a natural death. That will anyway go. That is ramp down that happens. All the new hiring, I do in the new company. There will be attrition invariably. That backfill I will not do in the old entity, rather I will do in the new entity. Here, if you look at it, have I shifted any value from the old to the new India company directly? No. Indirectly? Yes. The point is you have to do something which is a better way to do. It may be one of the better ways to do this way, where over a period of time it happens. But invariably many times what happens is clients will not have time. They're not having time, what you do, because what is ideal for tax may not be practically feasible. That's where invariably you sort of get stuck. So there you'll have to take a calculated risk in terms of how much you know, which way you know, etc.
So one question. You will have the IP rights in the old Indian.
Right.
You will have the software. You will have
Correct.
So
that I will sell the IP rights or do the license of the IP rights.
You will sell from the
Old India company to the new India company.
New India.
So there also the two routes are, one is I do it as a non-exclusive right transfer with the understanding that old India company doesn't license it to anybody, or I do a license transfer of IP. The problem here is more and more I transfer, it looks closer and closer to slump sale. Once it looks closer and closer to slump sale, the slump sale risk will be real. That's the challenge. So how do you layer it and do? So generally speaking, don't do any sale of asset itself. Do a license of IP. If I do a license of IP, IP may be valued like a $50 million for instance. Because one case we are dealing with, the question that came is what is the value of IP? Like this business, if we take it's $50 million worth, loss making. Now can I say the value of IP is only $1 million? Conceptually. Correct or not? If IP is $1 million on a cash flow basis, if you are making loss, where is the value coming from? So invariably it will have to be on the IP. And when we spoke to a lot of valuers, even the international valuers, etc., their point was in any startup, generally speaking, just for the name of the startup, the trademark that you have, it will be 20-25% of your value that is there is attributable to that. So if I am a $50 million company, if it's a customer facing company for instance, 12 million or 15 million of the value is just the trademark of it. Then you have something similar, another 30-40% on your IP. And more if you are a deep tech, then the value of our IP is much higher. Now the value of IP may be whatever. Let's say in this case, I would say a wild guess may be in a 50 million value, IP may be worth say 30 million. More or less it will be that way because only IP have generated so far which will exploit and then sort of do generate value later. Now the question is, it's a $30 million value IP. If I sell the IP, same risk will come. If I license the IP and say that whatever revenue comes out of the IP, I'm going to give you 10% royalty, then there's no risk of 30 million getting taxed or 10% of 30 million getting taxed. On revenue it's 10%, 10 may become 20, 10 may become 15. But your risk threshold or parameter is only that 5-10% on the revenue and not on the value. Next question that comes is a very interesting question. Then does it mean the new India company will never own the IP? The next question, because investors are coming into the new India company, what happens to the IP? That comes as a next question. So this in US is a fairly time-tested approach of what we call as die on the vine approach. What that means is old IP, if I'm not enhancing further, like if I take iOS for instance, Apple. When they came, it was iOS 1, now I don't know where it's reached, 17, 18 if I have reached. I use Android actually. Now, if Apple wouldn't have continuously innovated, whether the old system that is there, would it have any value to it? No. Over a period of time, it's lost its value. Now, if you look at iOS 6 today, it has no relevant or any use for that matter. Maybe some old phone somebody is having, it is working. So that way, if you look at it, whatever IP is there, the value of the IP deteriorates over a period of time, it comes to zero. Correct? Now, just going back to this, like say Apple, if I take iOS 6, I'll take as a cutoff and they try to do something like this. iOS 7, 8, 9, 10, everything developed in the new entity. Correct? And before initiating the development, what was the value of the IP? New IP was 0. Over a period of time, it becomes 100. The old IP was 100, today it becomes 0 over a period of time. Clear? What we call as a old IP will die, incremental IP will sort of catch up in value over a period of time. So that way after a 3-4 year period, it will so happen practically or in reality in many cases that the old IP will cease to have any relevance whatsoever most of the times. The new IP will have all the value. And also like one client we were discussing something similar we wanted to do. We asked them whether you will basically recreate this IP over a period of time. His point was simple. His was like a order matching platform. Like I place an order, somebody has a supply, it will basically match. His point was simple. This software is good enough. I'm never going to replace anything. It will be as is. In that structure, whether this will work, this thought process, that old IP will die, new IP will get value. No. Depends on case-to-case basis in some sense, but point in general, 99% of the cases, unless you're doing new development, the old IP will die. And we are playing on that part of old IP dying over a period of time, wherein my tax issue also dies along with that.
But in the licensing is done, the new
Royalty will come.
the new company will pay royalty to that amount. How would we take out from that old company?
See, the way it typically works is founders also have to get salary, so I'll pay salary there.
So eventually all the things from the old company will die.
Sir, old company will die, everything in old company will die, cash also will be eaten up, it will die natural death. Now, going forward here, from an investor standpoint, if you look at it, the 20% fellow, remember, put 10 million. He is holding shares in which companies now? Old India company. Is he also holding shares in Singapore company? Yes. Singapore company, say, put only $1,000, just for the sake of discussion. And assuming 100% of the value of Singapore company is derived from India, he is selling shares of the Singapore company. Is that liable to tax in India? Yes, no. And so there is that Vodafone case, 9-1, all of it will apply, you have to pay tax in India. What is the cost of the share? $1,000. Say, I'll take a wild, like an extreme example. Say, I sold the share of his 20% only at $12 million. What is his real gain? He put 10, he got 12, 2 is a real gain. Here, artificially, what is the gain? Entire 12 million or 12 million minus 1,000. Is it fair? No. How will you come out of it? Simple. Simultaneously, when he is selling shares of the Singapore company, he will also sell shares of the Old India company. Old India company doesn't have any value. No value. You will book full loss of 10 million there. You have booked a 12 million gain here. Both are happening in the same year. You will get an offset. With that offset, you sort of proceed. Only thing you will have to ensure here is the short term, long term you need to watch. If the old one is a long term loss and new one is a short term gain, you will not be able to offset. As long as you have held the new structure also beyond 2 years, you are basically safe. Clear? I touched upon all the aspects from cost of acquisition, moving the business, IP transition, how it overall happens. Clear? And again, many cases what also happens practically is, all the laptops also would be largely leased from leased suppliers. So what you do, simply you terminate the lease and release the asset there. Is there a movement from your side? No, it's happened in the back end. So those are all the finessing that happens over a period of time. Once you get into the groove, what all can happen. Net everything has a solution and everything comes with a risk. Is that risk tolerable, acceptable? And many cases what also happens is there a better way to do? Once you hit that point, then the question is a commercial call for the founder whether to do or not do. Because you don't need to be part of that discussion or that decision making. So that's where it sort of goes. Any doubt on this? Well, it's only 5 points, actually a lot more to it.
Is there any case for tax evasion kind of thing? See, your entire customer base in the old company moves to the new company, whereas you choose to sell piecemeal or lease your. Is there any risk as such? Are there any?
See, because it is happening within India, sir. Okay, is there a risk under GAR? There is a risk under GAR. Is the department justified possibly looking at this? Answer is yes. But the whole point here is, like in transfer pricing, if you look at it, say India was doing certain work. They terminate the contract in an MNC scenario and say they want to shift the work to Philippines. Is there loss to India in that particular scenario? Answer is yes, because whatever would have been the profit, you are basically taking out of India and putting in Philippines. So there is a concept of exit charge they'll apply, and a lot of APIs are signed around this exit charge concept. Saying that whatever profit India lost for the next 2 years, you pay tax on it, we let you go. But here, if you look at it, is the movement happening within India? Answer is yes. Is India as a jurisdiction losing any revenue? No. What should have been taxable according to the department on which tax has not been paid is a notional gain that would have arisen had it done the slum sale at full fair value. Is there an independent buyer willing to pay $50 million for buying the business? No. Has anybody got paid 50 million? No. Is anybody capable of getting paid 50 million? No. If you look at it commercially, there are a lot of other reasons which you can justify that India conceptually has not lost anything in the process, which is a very fair thing. Now the question here is, doing this, all this layering, etc., I'm trying to reduce the risk of an impact. But if you look at it conceptually, has there been any movement of value outside of India? No, it's within India is shifting. Somebody can still argue that the shareholding value shifted outside of India, but still it will be liable to tax in India if India is more than 50%. If India is less than 50%, then it's like tough luck, you can't do anything. So there are pros and cons, and again with GAR coming in, the whole thought process here, the aspect here is, anything you do should be backed by commercial reasons, strong commercial reasons. Strong commercial reason for you would be, some investor, your company as a company is dying, because if you are not able to raise money, it will die. You may be 50 million, tomorrow will shut shop. You are seeing reality today, companies being marked down by 80%, which are at billions of dollars of valuation. So that way, if you look at it, you can argue it both ways. But the point where I am coming from is, if you still want to do with all the commercial reasons, only people will do. Otherwise, no one will rack their brain for 6 months, 3 months to do something like this. It's never going to be easy. From our perspective, we can give idea, advice, and then leave. But we have seen so many people suffer because we'll have like 200 customers. Payment will come in the old company. We'll have to do in the new company. Some TDS is stuck there. What do you do? It's never going to be easy. People also will do, and only then there's a strong commercial reason. We need to sort of leverage on it from a GAR business. Clear? Any doubts on this?
Because we take quite a lot of time, right? Because see, the India entity, which the older one, we would want to give it as a license. See, the license will have a minimum kind of the benchmark. This is a fee which you will have to get. So, that here they pay tax on that, here they get the benefit of it of the expenditure. But then the valuation, let's say the person who's holding 20%, he has to sell that. That 10 million has to come down to a larger extent. It should come down to
10 million will become zero effectively.
No, but it takes a lot of time, sir, because you are still having the IP.
And IP, the point here is, once it's licensed and your only visible stream of income is the license fees, where is the value? And you're not doing any IP enhancement. As an IP, the cash flow also, if you draw, will only come down like this. And also today the operations are also not significant. And one more point in the license agreement, there is a concept of step model of royalty, which means today the value of the IP is the highest, I pay 10% royalty. After 1 year, the value falls because you're not enhancing it. From 10 it will come to 8, 6, 4, 2, 0. One hand, the royalty amount is coming down, while the operations may go up, volume wise the rate is falling. So everything put together, it may not make too much of a difference, and also promoters or founders will continue to draw salary here also. No? So on a net cash flow basis, if you run a DCF, it will be 0.
But why will they draw a salary here? After once there
There's
is
cash there.
No, there is only IP. No, because there is cash, they cannot withdraw a salary.
I understand. What do you do with the cash?
Distributed in form of dividend.
Huh? It's loss making company.
It will not make a loss because you're telling when you
Past losses are there, not till you eat up your past losses, how will you do it?
again with a
You'll not give up.
So the valuation report will be challenged over India.
Huh?
The valuation report will get challenged.
Which valuation?
The older company had made some valuation report, and on that basis they raised the fund.
Correct.
After 2 years, they have leased the IP and all those. Now, this particular valuation report will get challenged after 2 years. That over there tax liability can arise.
Can arise, but point is, certainly it can arise, but in the first 2 years, whatever you run your operations, it was somewhere catching up. Thereafter, some businesses sort of gone down, etc. So nothing is free from this. I'm not saying this you do or that you do. The whole point is, why people are doing this, they are doing so that they'll get acquired at a much higher valuation, etc. But as I told you, it's a significant amount of pain to go through. Because here what is happening is the entire business is getting disrupted because everything will move out of the company into a new company. IP has to move, everything has to move. So this is the other route. Wherever possible, we've been implementing it. Here what ends up happening is, many companies, startups, if you see, invariably there will be some 60-70% foreign shareholding. Anyway, there is sitting outside. Few cases they may be grandfathered, few cases it may not be. Bulk of the investment, since grandfathering went off, it's more than 6 years now, most of it may be non-grandfathered, as an example. What we do is, let's say, take off a scenario where 80% is held by foreign investors. Many cases we will find such similar scenarios. What we do here is, founders will set up a company in, say, Singapore. Everybody but the domestic investors can simply swap their shares in the India company into the Singapore company. Okay, I'll just give an example here. When the company got set up, say it got set up with $20,000 of the founders, which eventually will become 20% stake. Okay, so there are 20,000 shares in the company. All the other 80% guys who are holding shares in the India company swap their shares into the Singapore company. They get allotted 80,000 number of shares. Now, what is the shareholding of the Singapore company? 2080. What was the shareholding originally of the India company? 2080. Aligned that way. Now, only thing that is hanging here is founders are holding shares in the India company, correct? Because those shares are not actually swapped. If you swap, tax will come, FEMA will apply, all of that. So here the point is, the founder shares, whatever are there, will be held in India company, which can do a buyback of those shares over a period of time, such that for founder, what has happened, I have already given shares in the Singapore company at the time of setup. What I am effectively doing is taking away their shares in India. Buyback is exempt from tax. I don't even want to get into 56(2)(10) issue on buyback. Say I do the buyback at book value. Everything gets done, sorted, say effectively over a period of time. With that, the shareholding gets sort of aligned in Singapore. Here to look at it, have I set up a new company and moved my operations? No. Is there any slum sale that done? Any IP that is left behind? No. Operationally, nothing is happening. Everything in the company is continuing in the company. I've done some transaction at the shareholding level. Fairly clear? So wherever facts permit, these options have been implemented, are being implemented. Many cases what happens is, some investors, like that 80% guy may have come at 10 million value, somebody may have come at 100 million value. When I'm swapping, all of them need to swap at the same price. So that's a hindrance that somebody may look at. But what ends up happening is, okay, you pay tax today, your cost also goes up. So tomorrow when you sell, you at least don't pay double tax, but it's a liquidity issue today because when I've swapped a 10 million guy will also swap at 100 million. I need to pay tax today, but my cost base goes up. So eventually whenever I sell, I'll get a cost base of 100 million itself. So there's a timing difference in terms of when I pay the tax. That is one piece that typically comes. Other advantage of the Singapore holding company is many treaties, direct sale of shares of India company is taxable. Indirect sale of India company shares are not taxable. Even if you look at it today, the Singapore Treaty, Mauritius Treaty, and French Treaty for instance, it's something very similar, where what is taxable is a French company or a Singapore company holding shares in India company is liable to tax in India. Singapore company holding shares in another Singapore or a Mauritius company for that matter, which in turn holds shares in India is not liable to tax. So many cases that also is a negotiating point saying okay, you pay this tax. From here on any gain you make you will not pay tax, which otherwise you would have paid tax had you been in India on the entire gain you would have paid tax. So this is again depends on a lot of push-pull etc. These things are never easy because you have to involve the company, founders and all of the investors. Once there is a commercial buy-in, only then it will proceed. Okay, that was a share swap arrangement. Third option is doing a merger demerger with little bit of intelligence around the shares that you allot etc. Here I'll set up a new structure the same way like a slump sale option where Singapore sets up New India company. What we end up doing is the business or identified business of India company I take and demerge into the New India company. When I do a demerger, is it exempt? Okay, then valuation doesn't get into question or challenge there. This New India company can allot some sort of a preference shares to the investors, which over a period of time can come down in terms of value and not get into the granularity of it. It's a little complicated. As an option, this will work where I've done the merger. Whole of the largely the entire shareholding of the New India company continues with the Singapore company. The dilution is kept to a bare minimum in some sense. So with this what ends up happening is I'll end up moving all the transitioning all the business from old India to the New India. I also have the protective cover of an exemption. Clear? So this also works. Only thing is slump sale etc. If I need to do it's a 3-week process. Here I'll have to go to NCLT to do a merger or a demerger for that matter. RD doesn't work here. So therefore it will take about 6 to 8 months of time. If you have the benefit of time, then this may be a better way to do it.
So in this case, do we have a consultant?
No. Better is, anyway it's happening within India, so TP technically does not apply. Otherwise also this is exempt in the hands of the companies and not exempt in the hands of shareholders. Once there is exemption, then the computation itself is sort of machinery provision which will not apply. So here, simply put, since you brought up this point, if New India company has only nominal capital, correct? Because that's a newly set up structure. If I take the old India company with everything and merge, then old India company shareholders will become entire shareholders of the New India company also. Correct? Because value wise, like if you look at it, one was 10 rupees, another is 1000 rupees. If you merge, 1000 rupees shareholder only will get. But by doing this preferred share structure where it's convertible at future FMV etc., there's a play in terms of the swap ratio, where I get to keep like 70-80% shareholding intact below Singapore, while only the 10-20% can be diluted for this old shareholders, and that you do a buyback transfer whatever you do.
There can be one risk I will think common directors or common shareholders. It is not directly but indirectly there are common, so that can be a little risky from the TP perspective.
Definitely, that is the reason why they are accepting this. Now, if there is no commonality, why will anybody?
No, I said from a TP perspective.
Correct.
I mean, if you lift the
But the point, lift the wheel, everything is a problem.
No, that level, because the law itself recognizes directly or indirectly in the aspect that.
See, it's more like a small, on a relative basis, this has an exemption, some other structure didn't have an exemption. End result is the same, end objective is the same. But between the two, which is better?
No, but coming
I understand, I am asking a question. Between the two, which is better, an exempt structure is obviously better than a non-exempt structure. Because in all the cases, the play is on the value. One is play with exemption, another is play without exemption. Between the two, if you need to choose, any day I'll choose exemption. It's about which is a lesser evil to sort of live with. That's the way I would sort of put it. Because again, there is no ideal thing. If it's ideal, then you should not do this at all.
No, my only point was we say that EP risk is mitigated or it is negated, that may not be the
No, it's minimized. There's nothing like no risk.
Again, the business is
Sorry?
again.
No, what left?
All the contracts.
See, if I merge, what happens is everything will move. No? If I demerge, also pretty much substantially everything are moving. Only the shell remains. Only the shell company remains.
Okay.
If I'm doing a demerger, if I'm doing a merger, anyway that thing goes off. Then reverse also people have done where this new India company merges into the old India company and significant shares are allotted. More than what you sort of warranted. It's a dilution game because there the company also will continue, only the shareholding is getting shifted and that is happening through merger. Okay, then last 10 minutes I take. So far what we discussed all the complexities of if you are in India how to go out. Now 2 options I am discussing. If you are already outside because you have gone through one of those routes. Now you want to come back into India, what do we do? Like we are working on some 7-8 transactions like this as we speak. So the way I look at it is the overseas company is set up in say Singapore here or US for that matter, which in turn holds shares in India company. I want to do a listing in India and requirement here commercially is that all the shareholders wants to hold shares in India company directly. So that after listing they can go and sell whenever they feel like. They don't need to be governed by a holding company on top, the decision making at that level, etc. This is the commercial objective. After this, I want to go and do the IPO. It's fairly simple. One of the options that is there is 2 options rather. One is what can happen is the overseas company can simply sell the shares of India company to everybody and then distribute the money back to the shareholders as capital gain or capital reduction, whatever I can do. It will be, if you look at it, it's a 2-layer tax. Overseas company sells shares of the India company, you pay capital gain tax on it. To distribute the money, there is another either dividend or capital gain tax that will arise at the second time. 2-layer tax. How we can overcome 2-layer tax, which is perfectly legitimate under the law, is by doing a liquidation. Liquidation, what happens is in the hands of overseas company, there is no tax because it is not liable to tax in the hands of the liquidating company in terms of 46(1). In the hands of the shareholders of the company who got the consideration or distribution oversight, they need to pay tax on the difference between fair value of the share they got vis-a-vis the cost of the share. Just to sort of apply in this example, say I am a shareholder holding shares in a Singapore company. Say I am a 100% shareholder assuming. That Singapore company was holding 100% shares in India company. Singapore company gets liquidated. At Singapore company level, there is no tax that is payable. And this is all from an India context I am saying. Then Singapore company distributes the shares in the India company back to the shareholder. Fair? Now if you look at it from the shareholder's hand, what happens is, he gets suppose shares in India company worth 100 million. His cost of investment in Singapore company was only 60 million. On this delta of 40 million, he has to pay tax. Fairly clear?
Where it means India, Singapore.
In India.
India, he has to pay the tax for 40.
Correct. India has to pay tax because here I am assuming Singapore company is deriving majority of its value from India.
But there is no transfer of the business. It is going to the original investor only.
Point is right pocket, left pocket logic doesn't work. Because it is like, simply put, had this Singapore company sold shares of India company to its shareholders, it's anyway liable to tax.
After liquidation, it is going to the original investors.
Correct.
And in fact, there is no business connection, no transfer of the business.
But what asset is being transferred?
Asset is merely the people who was weighing the shareholding, they got the asset of them. It is the same. People are saying.
Value wise, I'm not saying they're gaining anything. Tax perspective, what is happening is when they put the money in Singapore, it was 60. Today, they are getting shares worth 100.
Means you are saying
So it's simple. Today, forget anything. I bought Reliance share today. It's say 1,000 rupees I bought. After 6 months, I will sell it at 1,500. Do I need to pay tax?
And next time when they will have to pay again, they will have to pay above the 100.
Correct. In this example, yeah, 100 becomes a cost base. 100 ultimately you say sell at 120 for instance. Only 20 you pay at that point in time. That's a fair thing. You are getting a cost step up.
And who will, from whom they will collect the tax?
From the shareholders.
No, from means India they will collect from the foreign investors.
Correct. India government will collect tax from the foreign shareholder. Why tax is applying here is shareholders are holding shares in the Singapore company. Singapore company is deriving majority of its value from the underlying India asset.
But the collection, way of the collection, how it
So those are the tricky things. What we are generally doing is either we are getting all the investors to pay advance tax. Otherwise, there has to be a withholding tax obligation in some sense for the Singapore company because it is distributing the assets. So we are getting all the shareholders to pay advance tax, get the challan and only then distribute. The point is tax is payable. Now the question is what is the administrative mechanism? Who will collect, who will pay, etc. And again this gets reported all over the place because there is a change in shareholding, direct shareholding of the India company. Then again there is change in indirect shareholding of the India company which again needs to be reported by India.
Indian company will have influence over the Singapore company.
Obviously.
And they will guide them to pay.
Correct. In a scenario like this, that's the way to do. And other facets here are period of holding typically gets reset because you're getting a step up, period also gets reset. But in liquidation under the income tax law, if you look at it, it's a little confusing. Cost of acquisition of the shares you get under liquidation is dealt with both under 49 and 55. Broadly what 55 says is that if there is a cost, if you are paying tax, your cost also goes up. And under 46 you need to pay tax. Connected section that is. 49.1 simply says it says cost of the previous owner. And period of holding, if you go to 242A, it links back to 49.1. So few of them take a position that even though cost step-up is available and have paid tax, period of holding has to go back. That is mixing and matching. So our view at least is either you take cost step-up or you take the period of holding. It cannot be both. Much rather this period of holding will never get. Why this becomes relevant is for non-resident shares in India company if you sell, if it's short term the rate is 40%, long term the rate is 10%. It's not like a 5% arbitrage, so therefore this points become very critical. Then last structure for the day. Many countries permit an outbound merger, which means for instance I can take a UK company and merge it with an India company. I can take a Mauritius company, merge it with an India company, what we typically call as a reverse merger scenario. Here, overseas company is holding shares in an India company. Objective is what? All the shareholders should become shareholders in the India company directly. How do I do? Like HDFC merger that has happened where it's merged into HDFC Bank, something similar. Where overseas company merges into the India company. Provided it is permitted under its domestic law, this merger can happen. From India's standpoint, it is all happening in a tax exempt merger. There is no calls to be taken. It's perfectly exempt. Beyond it doubt, period of holding for the shareholders will continue. Cost will be of the previous owner. Tax exempt transaction. Everything is clean from this structure standpoint. But only thing is, many countries do not permit a cross-border outbound merger. Again, if you look at it, Mauritius permits, UK permits, US permits, but there are tax complications around it. Singapore is the most often used example. Singapore doesn't permit Singapore company to merge into a foreign company. Like you cannot exit Singapore by way of a merger, that is not sort of allowed. Clear? So therefore, any of these things if you want to do, first you need to test whether it's permissible under that host company jurisdiction. Answer is yes. As an idea, this may be the best thing. Okay. With this, I'll conclude the session. Any questions? Happy to take. There are a lot more things, but it will take an hour more, so we'll just proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As well as thank you to all the members. Hope so it was really an interesting chapter for you guys. And it was interactive, I believe, because of administration reasons. We had to step down. So otherwise it was fine. May I request Vice Chairman to please hand over a memento to Mr. Amit Raj. Thank you, sir. Thank you, members. Just we'll meet the very next meeting in the next study circle meeting. It's on 23rd again. Thank you all.